Alright, so here's today's clip upload. Um, what can I say about it? It's going to look like all the others. Um, so yeah, whoever finds it, you win a no prize. So yeah, I think yesterday my chat about the erosion of speech freedoms in the UK was well, it's not only pertinent to the current climate, but it made me think of one or two things, one or two tertiary scenarios, and also it made me think about the whole concept of suppressing speech freedoms as a general philosophy or an ideal, for those who seek to do it. Um, whatever the reasons, and the reasons that powers that be seek to remove your speech freedoms are typically similar, in each case, in each scenario. You can go all the way back to, I suppose, centuries, millennia. Okay, ancient China, where they would slice off your tongue, and they weren't the only cultures to practice tongue removal for saying the wrong things to the wrong people, um, or generally using your voice to stoke up a movement or a point of view that ran contra to the established narratives and the control narratives that rulerships seek to implement. And okay, we're not quite at the stage yet in the UK where our governments and our police force, our politically motivated and run police force implementing government agendas, are seeking to have people's tongues removed, but effectively they are removing people's tongues, because when you remove people's freedom to say what they want to say, how they want to say it, and to whom they want to say it, or whomever, then effectively you might as well cut off their tongues. I don't care whether it's in the print format, with books and periodicals and print media. I don't care whether it's in the electronic spaces, typed, bytes of data. Either way, anything really that is a source of mass communication, or even interpersonal communication. Doesn't even have to be masses, does it? If we say the wrong thing to the wrong person and the wrong person decides to call the authorities on you, it doesn't really matter who else. If there's anyone else involved, the authorities might seek to act upon an infraction that they see as is prosecutable under whichever means of legislation they can find to use against you. And that's more like the current climate we're in now, where the powers that be, or the powers that we, the people, haven't somehow installed, repeatedly over the last 20 years plus. These powers are very, very sensitive to criticism, and they're very sensitive to criticism, not only of their actions, their inactions, and their ideals, And let's be honest, in British politics, we haven't had an ideologue in power for, I don't know, since Thatcher, probably. Yeah, a true ideologue, somebody who is unwavering and sticks with principles, a conviction politician, sometimes they call it. Um, you know, I mean, we nearly had, well, we didn't, because the Conservatives, Theresa May, still pretty convincingly won that election. But Jeremy Corbyn, the left wing socialist politician, MP, um, he came quite close to attaining power in the UK. It wasn't a foregone conclusion he was going to lose at the time, even though people said it was likely he would lose. He came a lot closer to winning an election and being installed as a Labour Prime Minister than a lot of people thought he would. And I think that's not because his unwavering adhesion to socialist, hard left socialist principles, you might even call them communist or Marxist thinking, philosophy. Not that most people found that particularly palatable, but I think more people saw him as a leader who would stand by his convictions. Whether that's true or not, we never got to find out. But I think that's how many people saw Jeremy Corbyn. And you can basically compare that to, I don't know, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, David Cameron, Gordon Brown, all these other fly-by-night prime ministers who it's almost impossible to really pin down what they stand for. I mean, they might be representing parliamentary parties that have an ethos, but these days there's such a fine line. There's a fine ideological line between the two main political parties. It's still kind of binary politics, isn't it? Well, we run a two-party system at the moment. We'll see what happens the next election, but I mean, I wouldn't really want to consider the Liberal Democrat Party as a realistic force in UK politics, although they have a few pockets of a popularity further down the south of the country, but a few enclaves where they have some popular MPs, but not sorry, not that many. I mean, I know they've got 70, haven't they? 70 MPs, but people pretty much reckon that was a fluke and it's not going to happen again anytime soon. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult to discern huge differences between the major political manifestos and policies of the two main parties. I mean, they're both pro-globalism, the globalist agenda. They're both pro the the climate, the green agenda. They're both pro-immigration, mass immigration, you could say, because that's what we have in this country. I'm not just talking about illegal immigration. I'm talking about all immigration, legal and illegal. Uh, they're all. You think of them. You think of the. They're both high tax. They're both high tax parties, and they both believe in fairly sizable state government, state controls over corporations, over industries, over media. You know, censorship controls, tax controls, legislative controls. I mean, there's really isn't much separating the practical aspects of Conservative and Labour, because they might talk up differences and argue on every time they're put on in front of a screen with the opposition representatives, but that's all. It's basically pantomime, right? And when you go into the House of Commons, again, pantomime. The people, the MPs that populate both sides of the aisle, they're pretty much there for the same reason, and it's not to represent the will and the feelings and the politics of their sorry of their constituencies. That's not really why they're there. I mean, that's how they get elected. But the real reason they're there is to implement the goals and the policies of their political color, their parties, right? So they're party people. They're not people. There are a few independents, but there's secular religious independents, and we all know why they're there. They're there to represent their faith. And there's all constituent independent MPs who run on constituency issues, various issues. They tend to be not so broad like the mainstream political representatives, but they're there to represent certain issues that apply to a certain demographic within their constituency, and they want to petition for it in Parliament. So they seek to attain parliamentary office. It's a free system, and nobody's barred from with certain exceptions, nobody's barred from becoming elected. But yeah, I mean, so with freedom of speech, I'll go back to what I was starting with. It's something that politics across the spectrum in the UK seems to have accepted as a legitimate tool for asserting control over the mass population, or sections of the mass population who value their speech freedoms and their related print and communication freedoms. So then you think about it, then you really start to break it down, and then you think, history apart. And yeah, I was talking about talking about dynasties, emperors, and religious sects and governments in going back numbers of centuries that would remove people's tongues, right? And I was saying that in essence, when you restrict somebody's speech, what you're doing is you're making speech transgressions punishable by the state. Yeah? So, if that means putting you in jail, or if it sorry, dear me, if it means punishing you with what's the word, injunctions to curtail your freedom of speech, if it means removing your communication privileges, i.e. stopping you from using electronic communication or print media or sending emails, yeah, all of that stuff. And if it means directly stopping you from going out in the street, standing up with a sign and talking out loud, if it means any of those things, or if it means, for example, even saying something in a conversation to somebody who could be in your own home, at your workplace, in the same vehicle as you, traveling with you, you name it. Any of these hypothetical scenarios could apply. And if you are, proven, without doubt, to have said something or used language that one or more people consider to be against the law, potentially. That's either in the context you've used the words or the language you've actually used itself, and to whom it might be directed. I mean, think of it. We're born, we're babies, little babies, and we go coo coo and wah wah, and then we start to form words. Ma ma ga ga da da. Then we start to listen and hear sounds, use our lips, put them into different positions with our tongue, and we form words, we construct sentences, we become vocal. And when we become vocal, suddenly the whole world of interpersonal communication is open to us as children. And then we go to school and we go through education because that's the law. And you don't own your children. Don't even think it. If you the state owns your children, right? Just like the state owns you. The state owns your body, your remains. You think you even own your own body? Well, you don't. When you die, nobody can do what they want with it. You certainly can't choose what happens to your body after you die. It becomes property of the state. And, that's for lots of reasons for social cohesion, for hygiene, for a lot of reasons. But still, if we don't own if we don't own the physical, our own physical bodies, and we don't own our children, we don't have any of that kind of dominion in Western culture and society. So if you don't want to send your children to school, right, the state will come down on you like a pile of breeze blocks, and they'll want to know why you don't want to send your children to school, state school, whatever school, any school. If you want to homeschool your children, there's another whole rigmarole you have to go through before they allow that to happen. And even if they do allow that to happen, there's very, very narrow curricula and guidelines. The guidelines are very restrictive of what you can teach your children. Even with faith-based stuff, they're still quite restricted. Although the controls they implement onto faith-based religion, private school religion, or religious school, or homeschooling, they're quite lax with that now, and I wonder why. Oh yeah, because they don't want to get into any debates of interfering with certain religions, shall we say non-Christian religions, or shall we just say Muslim religion. Anyway, but that aside, so your children go to school, they learn to use speech, they become verbose, and they develop a vocabulary, and they grow into adulthood. They hone that vocabulary, they become, they become socially, socially trained to use vocabulary, to use speech, to communicate. All these things, it's a natural consequence of how our society is organized. But then, they grow up and they become adults, and then all of a sudden, all the things we've learned, we have to then, consequently, in 2025's Britain, it seems that we now have to unlearn, because what we're now being faced with is an attack on our liberty to move our mouths and emit sounds from our vocal cords via our tongues and our teeth, and emit those sounds that form letters that go together to make words in certain orders that construct sentences that have meaning, communicative meaning, communication meaning. And it's that meaning that is now subject to restriction. And it's very political. I've got white skin, right? I was born Caucasian. 25% of me is Greek. The other 75% is a mixture of lots of things. Welsh, English, a little bit of other European. But that's mainly it. Excuse me, a bit of Corsican. But that's mainly it. And I've researched my my lineage, so I know quite a lot about that. But the fact is, as somebody whose skin is pale and is so far removed from any kind of African or black descent. I mean, originally, everybody comes from the continent of, well, as it was African, Pangaea. Well, no, but after that, when it became the African continent in more or less its present form, going back hundreds of thousands of years. And pretty much everybody comes from there, don't they? But in the present world we live in, as a pale-skinned person of generational Caucasian ancestry, I am not allowed to use certain words in a certain context, in certain speech, that people of a different continental ethnic origin and skin color are free to use, however way they wish, whenever they wish, in any context they wish. So I'm thinking, if we live in a free democracy, a fair society, what are the reasons why somebody else who lives in the same society as I do is free to use language that I can't use, or I'm prosecuted by the state? How has that become possible? Well, I can relate to you the reasons that the PTB give you for that. When they question you, they don't like those questions, obviously. If you ask anyone in authority, ask somebody who's connected to the police service, or ask anybody in in the parliamentary field, whether it's a an MP, a junior MP, somebody who works in a mayor's office or a parliamentary MP constituency's office. Ask any of those type of people that question, and you won't get an answer, because they're questions that they don't have the answer to, because literally there is no answer. But there is an answer. There's not an answer they can give you that is feasibly logical, right? So, for example, I grew up, went through my life. I had plenty of relationships with black people, mostly men. Apart from people I've dated or had passing acquaintances with. I've had at least 2, 3 long friendships with black men. One, okay, I can, perhaps the longest one was about a 20-year relationship, going back about 10 years ago. So I'd known him for some time, since I was in my 20s. A guy called Julian. Shout out, Jules, man, wherever you are. God bless. Anyway, so this is a relationship I had for about 20 years with a guy. He was my best friend. Well, my closest friend, somebody I would see more than once a week, socially, or, out or indoors in houses, in, our places. Anyway, and this was a guy who, okay, I'll tell you a little bit about him. We had something in common. He was a he was an inmate at a boys boarding school. Not the same one as me, because he was I think 6 years younger than me. 6 years younger than me. But he went to he was a ex-boarding school pupil, and so was I. And we kind of, we bonded over a lot of things, to do with leisure and pleasure. But also we had some things in common, right? But he's from a different background to me. His mom's from the Caribbean, came over to England. He was born, blah, blah, blah. I won't get into that. But he was the type of person who we'd go out, and this was probably this was the 1990s initially, and into the 2000s. We'd go out, we'd be in a bar or in a nightclub, and sometimes he would nudge me. We'd be cruising, for girls to take home or date or have one-night stands with, I guess. And sometimes he'd nudge me, right? With my drink, and he'd say, "Hey, Nick, look at that N-word that just walked in. He thinks he's a right fly N-word." And I'd be like, "Jules, man, I love the way you throw language around like that. It's funny, yeah?" I'd say, "But why do you call that black fella an N-word?" And we'd probably both be drunk at this point, right? And he'd say, "Nick, where I come from, everybody uses the N-word, and they use it to each other, and they use it about people, other people." And he says, "It's just like saying wanker, or it's like saying geezer, or it's like saying anything that normally, objectively wouldn't be that offensive, really. You would just, fly off, water off a duck's back." But in his circles, which obviously growing up were slightly different to mine, but not that different. In his circles, that kind of language was, he didn't have any problems using it or hearing it, although I was never the kind of person who would throw that kind of language around. But, we both had a shared love of late 80s hip hop and early wave hip hop and rap music and fusion. And obviously the N word gets thrown about quite a lot in those musical genres. And so, I would often repeat, well, I'd rap along or sing or whatever, and sometimes I'd say that word in that context. Just because I like the song or the cut or I like the track, and it's music that I listen to. It's a genre of music that I listen to quite a lot for quite a lot of years, and I still do. I still own every album by Public Enemy. I still own every album by Schoolly D, every album by NWA, and who else? There's a whole raft of artists. LL Cool J, I got most of his early albums. Run DMC. Anyway, yeah, you know what I mean. Everything from the mid to late 80s to the early to mid 90s. Cypress Hill, I've got all their albums. Anyway, so if you sort of grow up into your adulthood with this culture, then that kind of language isn't alien to you. It's almost, it's almost just background noise. Your ears don't prick up when you hear words that those kind of artists use in their music, in their art. So you just become conditioned to it, and it just becomes normal. And in essence, that's what language is, and that's what censorship does. The more you use language, the more mainstream it becomes, and the less impactful it becomes. But conversely, the more you censor language, and the more you restrict it and punish language, then the more incendiary it becomes, because you've made it that way. The powers that be have made it that way. And so, later on, I had another friend from Caribbean origin. He sadly passed away a few years ago. So, that makes me feel quite bad when I talk about him. But he was the opposite of the other guy I was talking about, whom I knew for 20 years. He was the opposite. He was a very sensitive guy. He was very touchy-feely. I mean, he was a big unit, and he used to go to the gym and bodybuild, But he was touchy-feely about language, about speech, about people. He was quite sensitive to criticism, and not that I criticize him because he's my friend, but we did have debates about stuff, and we'd often talk about things like language and bigotry, prejudice, all these things, and we'd talk about racial slurs and language. And he had a completely different opinion on it. He would never use racial slur words. He didn't really listen to that kind of music as well, that has a lot of those words in. They used to call it, I suppose, gangster rap music, or, urban hip hop, street music. That, you can't really get away from those words if you listen to that kind of genre of music. And today, you've got the modern variations that come out the UK, like grime and what's the other one? Drill. And yeah, all that kind of stuff that, trust me, I don't know anything about and have no inclination or desire to listen to. But anyway, yeah. So he was the opposing end of the spectrum of people I've encountered from that background, and so you can't paint everybody with the same brush, because feelings and opinions are subjective. And offense, offense is something that is taken by a person, by an individual. It's taken by choice, by they make the decision whether or not they are offended, or whether they're not offended by something that somebody else has said or done. And that decision, it might not even be uniform. It might not be, they might be offended, or they might decide to be offended by a certain person who does an action, or says something, and somebody else doing the identical action or saying something they're not offended by. Right? So it's almost arbitrary. It's a decision, an arbitrary decision. You can't. So therefore, in their eyes, one individual is guilty of offending them, and the other individual, who's done the same thing, is not guilty of offending them. And I say guilty, but technically it's not illegal to offend someone, but that doesn't mean you can't get prosecuted for using speech or words, because you can. Because there's also such a thing as there's incitement laws, there's hate speech laws, there's malicious communication laws, there's all these laws now. It's a convoluted web of legislation that makes it easy for law enforcers on their computers to connect dots very easily, and pull things from one thing you're recorded as having said or typed or done, connect it to something else, then connect it to something else, and all of a sudden you've constructed a case against that person. It's become very easy, because people are handing them the evidence, because people have been hoodwinked, or people have been confused as to the shifting line. People don't know where the line is, because the line doesn't stay constant. 1 minute you can call one ethnic group by a certain name. I don't know, BAME, black and minority ethnic. Is that what it stands for? I'm not even sure. So at one moment in time, that becomes an acceptable moniker. You can basically talk about a demographic of people. But 5 years ago, that didn't exist, right? Nobody had thought of it, right? Nobody had decided that was the acceptable terminology, or that was the one they accept. People of that demographic, ethnic demographic. But before that, it was, or there was another accepted, politically correct, as they call it, description. All right, there was another adjective you could use, and that was coloured, or people of colour, because then they became sensitive to the word coloured. Now, I'm coloured. I'm of colour. I'm not see-through. I'm not transparent, and I'm not white as a sheet. But white's a colour. Pink's certainly a colour. Off-white is a colour. Slightly Mediterraneanly swarthy brown is is a color. They're all colors, you know. So when people say that they're of color, what they really mean is they're dark skinned and not lighter skin. So you know, we the 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 activists, the people with agendas, the people who want something, and obviously want to take something away from you, like your rights to use language, and you know your all sorts of rights. They want to take them from you. That's their intention. They weaponize language, and they shift the rules to keep you unsure, and to keep you confused as to what you can and can't say. And they do this in conjunction with lawmakers who keep rewriting legislation and adding legislation that muddies the waters of what is legally permitted, and what could see you get yourself in trouble. And and yeah, this is turning into quite a long clip, so I'm going to end it here, and we'll carry on in another one. Over and out.